progress is usually imagined as movement, visible change, external motion, a sense of forward momentum that can be measured, tracked, or explained. When this movement slows, the mind reacts quickly. Stillness is interpreted as delay. Quiet is mistaken for stagnation. Lack of visible change becomes evidence that something is wrong. Yet there's a recurring psychological phase where progress does not disappear. It becomes invisible. Life continues. Responsibilities remain intact. Nothing collapses. But the inner sense of momentum alters. Plans feel less compelling. Ambition softens. The urge to push forward weakens without resistance. This shift often arrives without disruption. There is no crisis, no failure, no obvious reason to stop. Externally, life may look stable. Internally, something has changed. Carl Jung observed that when the psyche prepares for a major reorganization, it often withdraws energy from outward movement before offering a new direction. This withdrawal is not announced. It is felt. The feeling is stillness, not peaceful stillness, not meditative calm. Functional stillness, the kind that holds energy rather than dispersing it. In daily life, this phase often appears deceptively ordinary. A person may notice they are no longer driven to optimize every situation. They still perform their work. They still show up, but the internal urgency is gone. This absence creates confusion. Modern life conditions people to equate urgency with progress. Without urgency, activity feels unproductive. Yet studies in cognitive psychology show that periods of reduced goal-directed motivation often coincide with internal reassessment phases, where long-term priorities are unconsciously reweighted. These phases are not idle. They are evaluative. The evaluation happens beneath awareness. This is why the stillness feels passive. It is not. The psyche is active, but not outwardly expressive. Earlier, energy flowed toward expansion, toward achievement, toward external confirmation. Now that flow slows. The slowing is often misinterpreted as loss of ambition, but ambition has not disappeared. It has been suspended. Suspension is different from depletion. Depletion feels empty. Suspension feels full but unmoving. Many people report this phase as heaviness. Time feels thicker. Days feel quieter. There is less emotional contrast. High points flatten. Low points soften. Life feels neutral. Neutrality is unsettling in a culture built on intensity. But neutrality is not absence. It is containment. Carl Jung associated containment with psychic preparation. Before the psyche can reorganize itself, it must reduce outward expenditure. Energy must be gathered before it can be redirected. This gathering creates stillness. In real-world settings, this phase often emerges before significant life changes, even when those changes are not yet visible. Longitudinal studies in career psychology show that individuals who undergo major role shifts often experience a period of reduced engagement months before the external transition occurs. During this period, motivation dips, not because dissatisfaction increases, but because identification with the current role weakens. Weakening identification produces stillness. The person no longer invests emotionally in what is about to change. But because the change has not yet occurred, the stillness feels premature. This timing gap is what creates discomfort. The mind expects cause and effect to align. Stillness should follow resolution, not precede it. The psyche does not operate on that timeline. It prepares first, acts later. This reversal confuses the ego. The ego relies on narrative continuity. It wants to know what is happening and why. During this phase, answers do not arrive. Not because they are hidden, but because the psyche has not finished reorganizing. Language arrives after structure. Stillness is structural. In daily experience, this often shows up as reduced emotional investment. You may still care, but the care feels quieter. You may still plan, but the plans feel provisional. Nothing feels urgent enough to demand immediate commitment. This can trigger anxiety. People may attempt to force movement, to reignite motivation, to create urgency artificially. These attempts usually fail because the psyche has already withdrawn support. Carl Jung noted that when conscious effort fails repeatedly, it is often because the unconscious is moving in a different direction. The resistance is not weakness. It is regulation. Stillness regulates timing. It prevents premature action. In practical terms, this regulation protects against building the next phase of life on an outdated foundation. Research in decision science supports this. Major life decisions made during periods of high emotional drive are more likely to be reversed. Decisions made after a neutral consolidation phase tend to be more stable. Stillness creates that consolidation phase. It holds action in suspension. This suspension can feel frustrating. You may sense that something is changing, but you cannot name it. Old motivations no longer pull. New motivations have not appeared. This gap feels empty, but it is not. It is transitional. Carl Jung describes such phases as liminal states in psychological development. The old orientation has completed its function, but the new orientation has not yet taken form. In liminal states, movement pauses. Identity loosens. Future orientation fades. This loosening is essential. Without it, the psyche would carry old assumptions into new contexts. Stillness allows those assumptions to dissolve. In everyday life, this may look like a loss of interest in self-definition. You may find it harder to describe what you want, what you are working toward, who you are becoming. This is often misread as confusion, but confusion implies disorder. This is not disorder. It is pre-organization. The psyche is reorganizing priorities without consulting language, because language would interfere. Studies in neuroscience show that periods of reduced verbal self-referential processing often precede insight and behavioral shifts. The brain reduces narrative activity to allow new associations to form. Stillness supports this reduction. This is why the phase often feels quiet mentally as well as emotionally. Fewer internal monologues, less rehearsal, less anticipation. The mind becomes less occupied with the future. This can feel like stagnation, but stagnation involves blockage. Here, nothing is blocked. Nothing is being pushed. Energy is present, but it is being held. Held energy creates pressure, not pressure to act. Pressure to wait. Waiting is difficult because it offers no feedback. You do not know if you're doing it correctly. You cannot optimize it. You cannot measure progress. This lack of feedback often triggers self-doubt. Yet the psyche does not require feedback during reorganization. It requires tolerance. Tolerance of ambiguity. Tolerance of stillness. Tolerance of not knowing. This tolerance is rarely rewarded immediately, but it prevents interference. Carl Jung emphasized that premature movement disrupts individuation. When the ego forces clarity too early, it delays genuine integration. Stillness prevents this. It removes the option of force. In daily life, this may be experienced as a strange calm paired with uncertainty. You are not distressed, but you are not energized. You are not lost, but you are not directed. This in-between state is uncomfortable because it lacks narrative. Nothing is wrong. Nothing is complete. The psyche exists comfortably in such states. The ego does not. This tension is part of the phase. The stillness is not meant to be interpreted. It is meant to be endured, not passively, but attentively. The attention is inward. Even if you are not consciously introspecting, you may notice subtle shifts. What once triggered reaction now feels neutral. What once demanded explanation now feels unnecessary. This neutrality is not detachment. It is deactivation of outdated emotional circuits. Neuroscientific research shows that emotional salience decreases when cognitive schemas lose relevance. The brain reduces emotional charge when a framework is no longer useful. Stillness accompanies this reduction. It signals that the psyche is disengaging from old frameworks. This disengagement creates space. Space is uncomfortable, but necessary. Without space, nothing new can form. The psyche does not build on top of noise. It waits for quiet. This is why the phase appears before visible change, not after. Stillness is not the absence of progress. It is progress moving underground. This realization does not resolve the phase, but it reframes it. You are not behind. You are not stuck. You are not missing momentum. Momentum has paused because direction is being rebuilt. That understanding settles quietly. without reassurance, without excitement, just recognition. Something is not moving yet, because something is being prepared. When stillness persists, the psyche is no longer deciding whether to change. That decision has already been made. What remains unresolved is structure. This is the part most people do not see. They experience the quiet. They feel the pause. But they assume nothing is happening because nothing is visible. Internally, the opposite is true. Carl Jung described this phase as a withdrawal of psychic energy from previously dominant orientations. When an orientation has fulfilled its developmental role, the psyche does not dismantle it through conflict. It removes investment. Investment is what made the old direction feel alive. Once investment withdraws, activity continues, but meaning fades. This fading is not loss. It is detachment. Detachment here is not emotional distance. It is structural disengagement. The psyche is unhooking itself from frameworks that can no longer support further development. Earlier, identity may have been organized around momentum, around striving, around improvement, around becoming something specific. These orientations are effective for a time. They create movement. They organize effort. They give shape to ambition. But they also create rigidity. When the psyche reaches a limit of what that structure can produce, it does not announce completion. It quiets. This quiet is not rest. It is reconfiguration. During this phase, several internal processes occur simultaneously. First, future projection weakens. The mind no longer pulls itself forward through imagined outcomes. Plans feel less compelling. Goals lose emotional charge. This is often interpreted as a motivational problem. Research in motivational psychology shows that when long-term goals lose emotional salience, it is often because the underlying value structure has shifted. Motivation does not disappear randomly. It follows meaning. When meaning reorganizes, motivation pauses. This pause is functional. Without it, the psyche would continue chasing goals that no longer align with its emerging structure. Second, emotional intensity decreases. Experiences that once triggered strong reactions feel muted, not numbed. Muted. This emotional flattening is often mistaken for disengagement or depression, but depression involves depletion. This state does not. Energy is present, but it is not being expressed emotionally. Neuroscientific findings support this distinction. During periods of internal restructuring, the brain reduces limbic reactivity while increasing integrative processing across networks. Emotion quiets so that reassessment can occur without distortion. Quiet emotion creates space. Third, identity loosens. You may notice that descriptions of who you are feel less convincing. Labels feel provisional. Narratives feel incomplete. This can be unsettling. Identity provides continuity. Without it, orientation feels unstable. But Jung emphasized that identity must periodically dissolve for individuation to continue. The self cannot reorganize while the ego insists on maintaining a fixed image. Quiet phases loosen that insistence. The psyche does not destroy identity. It suspends it. Suspension allows restructuring without collapse. This is why the phase feels neutral rather than chaotic. Neutrality is containment. Contained states often feel heavy. Not emotionally heavy. Structurally heavy. Time feels slower. Moments stretch. Waiting becomes unavoidable. This slowness is not inefficiency. It is recalibration. Cognitive studies show that when the brain disengages from future-oriented simulation, subjective time perception slows. Without constant anticipation, the present becomes denser. Density is necessary for integration. Integration requires contact with experience as it is, not as it is projected. This is why the psyche withdraws projection during quiet phases. Projection interferes. It pulls attention away from what needs to be reorganized. During this period, the psyche is reorganizing authority. Earlier, authority may have been external. Validation, progress markers, achievement, recognition. These elements once regulated internal stability. When they lose effectiveness, the psyche begins relocating authority inward. This relocation cannot happen while attention remains externally oriented. Stillness supports the shift. In daily life, this often appears as reduced concern with how things are perceived. You may still notice perception, but you are less compelled to manage it. This is not indifference. It is disengagement from regulation. Studies in social psychology indicate that when individuals stop relying on external feedback for self-assessment, their stress markers decrease, even if external demands remain unchanged. Internal regulation replaces external calibration. This replacement requires time. Quiet time. The psyche cannot rush authority relocation. Another process occurring during this phase is the withdrawal of compulsion. Earlier, action may have been driven by internal pressure, by urgency, by the need to maintain momentum. During quiet phases, compulsion weakens. You may still act, but the inner push is gone. This absence can feel disorienting. Compulsion provided structure. Without it, action feels optional. But compulsion also distorts choice. Jung warned that compulsive movement often masks unresolved inner conflict. When conflict is being integrated, compulsion dissolves. Its disappearance feels like stillness. In reality, it is alignment beginning to form. The psyche is testing whether action can emerge without force. During this testing period, it withholds energy from impulsive behavior. Behavior slows. This slowing is protective. It prevents premature commitment to forms that are about to change. In practical terms, this is why people often avoid major decisions during quiet phases without consciously deciding to do so. They delay. They wait. They hesitate. This hesitation is not fear-based. It is structural. Decision-making research shows that hesitation increases when value hierarchies are being restructured. The brain delays choice until internal criteria stabilize. Stillness stabilizes criteria. Another key reorganization involves attachment. Attachments to outcomes. Attachments to identities. Attachments to future images. During quiet phases, these attachments loosen, not through rejection, through irrelevance. What once mattered still exists, but it no longer grips attention. This can feel unsettling. Attachment provided emotional intensity. Without it, life feels flatter. But flatness here is temporary. It is the absence of distortion. Attachment magnifies experience. Detachment normalizes it. Normalization is necessary before redirection. Jung associated this phase with the withdrawal of projections. When projections dissolve, the psyche reclaims energy previously invested in imagined futures or symbolic roles. That reclaimed energy does not immediately express itself. It consolidates. Consolidation feels like pressure without movement. Pressure is not asking for action. It is holding material together. This holding is what allows reorganization to complete without fragmentation. In daily life, people often misinterpret this pressure. They assume something is wrong because nothing is happening. But pressure without movement is the hallmark of internal work. External work produces movement. Internal work produces density. Density precedes stability. This is why the phase feels preparatory. Not because something good is guaranteed, but because something incomplete is being completed. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological development is cyclical, not linear. Periods of expansion are followed by periods of contraction. Without contraction, expansion becomes inflated and unstable. Quiet phases are contraction phases. They pull energy inward. They reduce noise. They simplify internal structure. This simplification is often invisible, but its effects are cumulative. By the end of this phase, many things will no longer feel necessary. Not because you decided to let them go, because they no longer fit. Fit is the signal that reorganization has progressed. The psyche recognizes fit before the mind does. Stillness allows that recognition to emerge. This phase does not resolve itself through insight. Insight may come later. What resolves is alignment. Alignment between where energy is and where life is moving next. The psyche completes this alignment quietly, without instruction, without urgency, without announcement. The stillness remains until it is no longer needed. And when it leaves, it does not leave behind clarity. It leaves behind readiness. Readiness without tension. Readiness without pressure. Readiness that does not feel like anticipation, just availability. That availability is what the psyche has been preparing. And that preparation required silence, stillness, time, nothing more, nothing less. When movement returns, it does not arrive as momentum. There is no surge, no urgency, no emotional confirmation that something has shifted. In fact, the first sign that the quiet phase has ended is often missed. What changes is not how strongly you want to move forward. It is how little resistance remains when you do. Earlier, action felt blocked, not externally, internally. Effort met friction. Decisions stalled. Initiatives dissolved before they formed. Now that friction is absent, not replaced with enthusiasm, simply removed. Carl Jung described this as the moment when psychic energy is no longer required for internal reorganization and becomes available again for outer life. The psyche does not announce this transition. It releases inhibition. Inhibition had served a function. Now that function is complete. The release feels ordinary. You wake up and do what needs to be done, not because you are driven, because nothing is stopping you. This ordinariness is crucial. Most people expect psychological change to feel dramatic, but drama belongs to conflict. This phase follows resolution. Resolution does not excite. It stabilizes. In daily life, this shows up in subtle ways. Tasks that previously felt heavy no longer carry emotional weight. You complete them without commentary. You stop thinking about them afterward. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that when internal conflict resolves, task completion becomes faster not because of increased motivation, but because cognitive load decreases. Fewer internal negotiations occur. You are no longer persuading yourself. This is the difference. Movement resumes because it no longer needs justification. Earlier, action required reasons. It needed meaning. It needed reassurance. Now, action responds to context. Something needs attention. You attend to it. Then you stop. This proportionality is new. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity expresses itself through proportion rather than intensity. When the psyche is aligned, behavior matches circumstance without excess. Excess disappears. In conversations, this appears as concise responses. You say what is relevant. You do not elaborate unless asked. Not because you are withholding, because there is nothing more to add. Communication research confirms that concise speech following a quiet phase is perceived as more confident and more grounded, even when content remains unchanged. The absence of emotional leakage signals completion. Others adjust quickly. They stop pressing. They stop probing. They stop interpreting silence as absence, not because they were instructed to, because the signal has changed. You may notice that people respond to you differently. They do not require the same explanations. They do not demand the same reassurance. This can feel strange. You did not change your behavior intentionally. You did not assert anything. What changed was density. Your presence carries more weight because it is no longer dispersed. Carl Jung described this as the ego no longer standing in the foreground of experience. When the ego steps back, the self regulates orientation. This regulation feels calm, not passive. Calm. Calm allows timing to become intuitive. You sense when to move and when to wait, not because you calculated it, because the internal noise that once interfered has settled. Decision-making becomes quieter. You still evaluate, but evaluation is shorter, less recursive. Studies in decision science show that when internal value hierarchies stabilize, decision latency decreases even without increased confidence. The brain no longer cycles through competing criteria. Criteria have aligned. This alignment is one of the clearest signs that restructuring has completed. Life begins to move again, but it moves differently. Earlier, movement was driven by anticipation, by future projection, by the promise of becoming something. Now, movement responds to what is present. You act because something is there, not because something might be. This present-based movement is more sustainable. It does not burn energy. It conserves it. You may notice that you are less tired, even when doing the same amount of work. This is not rest. It is efficiency of alignment. Psychological fatigue often comes from inner division, not effort itself. When division resolves, effort costs less. Quiet authority emerges here, but not as a concept. It emerges as reliability. You do what you say you will do. You stop when it is done. There is no internal performance around it. Others trust this consistency, not because you are impressive, because you are predictable in the right way. Predictable does not mean rigid. It means coherent. Carl Jung emphasized that coherence is the outcome of individuation, not its goal. When coherence appears, it does not need to be maintained consciously. It holds itself. You may notice that you are less concerned with outcomes, not indifferent, less attached. Outcome attachment was tied to identity. Now identity no longer depends on outcome. This reduces pressure. Pressure once created urgency. Urgency created movement, but that movement was costly. Now, movement happens without pressure. This is a paradox. You move more easily when you stop needing to move. In relationships, this shift is especially visible. You no longer push for resolution. You no longer manage dynamics excessively. You state what matters. You let silence stand. Relationship research shows that reduced overfunctioning leads to more balanced dynamics over time. When one person stops compensating, the system recalibrates. This recalibration does not require confrontation. It happens naturally because your internal state has changed. Carl Jung often noted that psychological change alters relational fields without direct intervention. When one's psyche reorganizes, interactions adjust. You may notice that conflicts resolve more quickly or dissolve without discussion, not because issues disappeared, because they no longer attach. Attachment gave conflict its fuel. Without it, disagreement loses momentum. Life feels workable again, not extraordinary, not elevated, workable. You are not waiting for something to begin. You are not bracing for something to end. You are engaged where you are. This engagement does not feel like effort. It feels like participation. The quiet phase did not prepare you for a specific outcome. It prepared you for alignment. Alignment allows movement to resume without distortion. You are no longer pushing against yourself. This is a completion, not a breakthrough as spectacle, not a transformation as identity, a return of movement without tension. Carl Jung understood that when psychic energy finishes reorganizing, life resumes its course naturally. The psyche does not reward the ego with certainty. It restores function. Function is enough. You move. You pause. You respond. Nothing feels delayed. Nothing feels forced. The stillness did not mean you were falling behind. It meant the foundation was being rebuilt. Now that the foundation holds, life can continue, quietly, steadily, without needing to prove that anything has changed, because what needed to change already has. The quiet phase was never a pause in life. It was a pause in distortion. Nothing stalled. Nothing was delayed. Nothing was missing. What withdrew was not momentum, but compulsion. What softened was not ambition, but attachment. What slowed was not progress, but pressure. Carl Jung understood these intervals as moments when the psyche reclaims its energy before moving again, not to create something extraordinary, but to restore proportion between inner structure and outer life. Stillness was the signal of that restoration. It did not promise outcomes. It did not announce direction. It simply held space until alignment returned. When movement resumed, it did so without urgency, without performance, without the need to prove that something had changed. Because what changed was not visible. It was foundational. And when foundations settle, life does not rush forward. It continues, quietly, steadily, from a place that no longer needs to push.